So we have a terrific panel for you today, and I'll start with Nick Taylor-Vaisey. I get your name wrong every single time. He is Politico's Ottawa bureau chief and the lead author of the Ottawa Playbook. He spent over 15 years in journalism, and he spends his day with the people behind politics in Canada, and he's obsessed with Canada-US relations. He's previously worked at Maclean's magazine. Hannah Thibedeau is an award-winning veteran journalist who covered Parliament Hill for more than 20 years, and she survived that. And she most recently served as national news anchor of CBC News Live and is currently the Executive Communications Officer of Global Public Affairs. And Elamin Abdelmahmoud is the host of CBC Radio's daily show Commotion and a writer at large for BuzzFeed News. Elamin is the author of Son of Elsewhere, a memoir in pieces. And if you have not read that book, I encourage you to get it from Indigo. Buy that book from Indigo. It's a fantastic book. It's a must-read. His work has appeared in the Globe and Mail, Maclean's, and Rolling Stone magazine. So welcome all of you. We're going to talk a lot about narratives and storytelling in this panel. And stop laughing at me.
We're laughing. I just was like, you were in Rolling Stone? I didn't know that.
Yeah.
So we know that narratives carry the power to compel us to positive action, but can also compel us to act against our own interests. All of you in different ways recognize the power of narrative. And so I'm going to ask a number of questions and choose the ones that you want to answer. And I'm going to start with Nick. How do we create narratives that command attention and inspire change? Is it about connecting to our common values? Are we in an era where influence trumps information and podcasts have now become the new news medium? And what should policymakers understand about the power of narrative? So Nick.
So I want to talk about one word that you used, divisive. And should we lean into, as a country, as a society, into shared values versus division? But here's the thing: like everybody in this room, I was talking to somebody out in the lobby earlier today about this. Everybody in this room is stressed out right now. You're stressed out for either macro reasons or micro reasons.
Why? What's happening?
Yeah, like
there's something going on.
It's just like the drumbeat of our lives, right? Is everybody's stressed out, and so whether you're stressed about politics or business or rent or groceries or mortgages or
some fellow
retirement
in the US.
savings or like the guy in the White House or whatever it is.
Who's he?
Don't know. Never met the guy.
Never.
How can we possibly have conversations, even as we, as in this room, all agree that like, unity is important in this moment? But how can we possibly have conversations without being divided and disagreeing? I mean, how can we possibly agree about all the big issues all at once? And so, in my world, the goal is to harness all of that stuff into either a newsletter or a feature story or something that gives voice to all of those colliding interests in a way that is not malicious. Like, I think there's a difference between, of course, malicious, harmful, weaponized rhetoric versus just division. So I say kind of like lean into the division in a useful way so that you can eventually build trust with, in my case, readers, and the case of everyone in this room. Everyone's got relationships. It's the foundation of everything we do all the time. That only starts and ends with trust.
I want to jump in there. Is that okay, Elamin?
Fine.
Thank you. Yeah. He's so good. It's like I got to get in before he starts. But narrative really is the secret sauce. We all have narratives in this room. And one of the big things, facts really don't sell the story. It's the narratives behind it. You want to hear, facts are important, don't get me wrong, but it's telling those stories in a compelling way that grasp that viewer, that listener, that reader, because that's what ties everybody in. You want to hear stories about, okay, this connects me, why? And then you add the facts in, why? And it's really important, and that's what will grasp a viewer, is if you have that compelling narrative, that compelling story to tell, that is where you are going to be heard. And that is a vital thing. And Elamin does this very well in telling stories every day. And even a senior political reporter, not old political reporter, yeah, I know, that's what I had to keep telling everybody. But on TV, when you came to reporting on politics on a daily basis, you had to connect it to the viewer. And that's the most important thing. Otherwise, they're just glossing over. And you do the same thing with you make it exciting, you make it factual, and those are the important things when it comes to narrative.
First of all, I've been a longtime enemy of Nick Taylor-Vaisey, and I've been in love with Hannah Thibedeau for a long time, so it was just a delight to be sharing the stage with these people.
We had to separate
It's
those
true,
two.
we did. It was out of control. I will say
Horrible
this.
book. I hated your book. Everyone's afraid to say
Did
it.
you
knew
read
it.
it and read the Rolling Stone article though?
Is this going as well as you planned?
I was going to say, no need to say anything about me, Elamin. I'm okay.
She was afraid this was going to happen, by the way.
And we're here. No, okay, so the thing that I'm really sensitive to is that in the battle between narrative and facts, facts get their ass kicked every time. And I think there's sort of a long history of narrative being the strongest selling point of that drives history. I mean, quite often people are compelled by a story, whether that story is true or not. Mm-hmm. And that has a lot to do with, I think, one of those books that really changed something for me was reading Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow. And that book was largely about the things we register and the things we don't. And the things we register are emotional. And narrative gets at the emotionality of story and the emotionality of policy and the emotionality of any kind of public story. And I think quite often when people are thinking about how to marshal facts in a way that is compelling and convincing to people, they forget the emotional part of narrative, which is that's the part that people connect to, right? And what are elections but plays for your emotions, right? I mean, using facts, using certain arguments, hopefully using facts in most cases, but for the most part, we are talking about people who are trying to make a play for emotions. And we get into pretty dangerous territory when we forget that emotions are a very important part of how these conversations are had. And I feel that quite often in policy conversations, that's kind of secondary, and I would like to see it come a bit more to the fore.
And I think that's how people in this room can make sure that you have all these brilliant public policy ideas, that they don't get left on the floor in here. And this is what we were talking about on our call ahead of time. Narratives can drive that emotion, that can drive public policy, it can make changes to what public perception is, it can make changes to what policy politicians actually do. It's really vital that you get these stories out there and not just sit here and talk amongst yourselves too about how important all these public policies are, because you want to influence change. And to influence change, you need to tell great stories.
Exactly. Okay, well, Nick, speaking of stories, now you self-confessed have said that you are obsessed with the Canada-US conversation.
Been to 49 states.
So tell us,
49 states.
How has that conversation changed in recent months?
So Canada is super hot right now, I would say.
Yeah.
Empirically speaking, I work with colleagues not just in Washington, but also in Brussels and Paris and London and Berlin. Politico has tentacles in all sorts of power centers. And before the last few months, I mean, it's not that we didn't work together, but we would work together on a story-by-story basis. Now, they're so interested in trade and energy and defense and security and where Canada is at and what is happening with our domestic politics, which is not something I think an American audience would typically take a lot of interest in.
No.
They're asking who this Mark Carney guy is. Some even know who he is from his past life. But we have this ability now to collaborate with colleagues who just have a reason to be interested in us. And I don't think Canada is necessarily the most important piece of most of those stories, but we are an essential piece of many of them. And that offers us a moment to have conversations about who we are with people who typically have more interest in, like Washington cares about Washington.
Yep.
Yeah,
you go.
No,
you go.
Okay,
You
fine.
go.
Our great literary critic, Northrop Frye, and Margaret Atwood sort of coined this phrase that Canada's culture is formed as a garrison mentality. And there's two sort of enemies outside that garrison. The first enemy is the weather, which fucking true, But the second enemy, and more meaningfully, is actually the United States, and not an enemy, but sort of a force to define yourself against. When you look at the way that people are thinking about Canada now, even in those power centers that you guys have these tentacles in, is that the conversation? Like the sort of contrast between Canada and the US, is that the only way that we get on the radar?
Well, I think a big piece of it is before Trump was inaugurated for the second time, and the whole world was preparing for that.
Yeah.
The question for Canada was, you've done this before. You renegotiated a trade deal that he actually liked and championed and said was the best ever. So what was that all about?
When did that
a
happen?
lot of people in government at the time, the Liberal government, were, they were hot at that moment. They were hot for their own way. Not domestically. Not with voters here.
No.
Not domestically, but with people who are interested in how to deal with Trump. And now I think it is this understanding that Canada is right beside this force and is clearly in the crosshairs on a consistent basis, and is also at the same time part of all these multilateral organizations and just has tentacles everywhere. So
I think the discussions have really grown about Canada in particular, in particular the North, and one of the issues that I'm talking about and dealing about, they actually feel like this is now their moment to be seen, to be heard, because guess what? That volatile fella, I keep calling fella, like I guess I better call him President Trump, he's threatening our sovereignty of the North. So now it's this attention that's being grabbed by, look, we need to make sure that we're protecting our sovereignty, because if we don't protect our sovereignty, then guess who wants it? Not only the US, the Chinese would like to be up there, the Russians would like to be up there. And I think people are starting to realize that, hey, we need to hear these stories and tell these stories. I'm going to tell a little bit more about that later in what we're discussing here, but it's that storytelling to ensure that Canadians are informed about how important our country is to us. And you can really feel this prickle on your arm. That's how I keep describing it, this prickle on your arm of importance and how much love we're feeling, that maybe this might be a good thing that happened from President Trump, is that we're becoming more, hey, look, we need to be proud of who we are. We need to describe who we are. We can't allow someone to tell our story, our narrative. We need to be telling that.
But can I just say, like, sorry, but can I just say, like,
sorry?
Sorry, but even in the thing that you just said, though, the return of this prickle on the arm, the conversations we're having about the meaning of the flag in this country has radically changed in about 3 months.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Because there was much consternation about the response from Ottawa in terms of raising up the orange flags after the residential schools in Kelowna. And the place that the flag had occupied for a couple of years. And then there was sort of an attempt to say, actually, the flag belongs to people who want to have the convoy conversation. And I think it's a little bit tough to say the flag belongs to people who are critical of the Prime Minister. That doesn't compute for my brain, But there is something to be said about a reclaiming of the flag for the country, and the narrative just around the flag has changed just in the last 3 months. And that's an extension of that idea of, we're paying attention a little bit more to what we love about our country.
So we've talked about the narrative and the message, but what about the medium? Because Hannah, you've written about the fact that there's a crisis in the media ecosystem, and at the same time, you're very optimistic about the role for traditional media. Do you think traditional media still has a role? Is it still relevant?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And until there's a replacement for traditional media, the mass media, it's going to be there. It gives validity. It gives nuance. It gives all of the credibility, and maybe people disagree about what some of the media are saying out there, but it still has that gravitas and importance to it. However, it is getting smaller, and I've written about this, and it's something that really disappoints me. I have left because I wanted to find new ways to tell stories, and I say lucked out, but worked really hard in telling stories that inspire me. So when it comes to mass media, I'm sitting there, and there is this gentleman, Agnico Eagle Mines chair, Sean Boyd, sitting on a panel telling all these fabulous stories about the North. And I was like, oh man, I wish I worked at CBC. I could tell those stories. And I thought, no, I wouldn't. I'd be able to tell 1 2-minute story, and no disrespect to them. It's just that their newsrooms are cut, their budgets have been slashed, their reporters have been cut. It's like, I would love to tell these stories, but I'd be able to tell a 2-minute story and then we're done. So I went and I pitched a podcast to them because they're important stories to drive public policy and public opinion. So we're telling stories of the North in order, and it was because I was inspired by someone who was a great storyteller. So now we're telling those stories in different ways, and podcasts are growing so much, you know. It's, in fact, for Gen Z, hold on, I put numbers down, but anyway, I'm not gonna look for the numbers. But they are growing. People on a regular daily basis now don't often go to the typical media to get their information. They go to podcasts to get that information. However, we have to be responsible with it as well, because we are not news broadcasters. We are telling stories, but it's not potentially the news of the day. So it's a fine line. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I keep sort of trying to work through the podcasting boom and the meaning of it long term, you know?
Same.
Because one, what the reality is also, like, Joe Rogan is the most popular podcaster around, and that
There's that.
You know, and he doesn't claim to be a news person. He's like, every time that he gets criticized for saying something, he's like, well, I'm just a comedian, you know, just a comedian with millions of followers. And there's something to be said about the fact that that's actually true. Like, that's the pitch that he's making. He's not making the pitch that he's a news organization who's like, I will go through the proper vetting process of a story. He's making the pitch that he's someone who just wants to have these conversations. The downstream effect of this is that when sources like that sort of replace or supplant news organizations that actually have standards, that actually do the news gathering, what you end up with is a movement towards a very opinion-based media environment. Look, there's a podcast boom, but also at the same time, the most expensive part of doing news and doing journalism is news gathering, and no one wants to fund it, right? Like, no one wants to fund it except for the traditional media organizations who will send Nick to, where'd you go? Where have you been this election, pal?
A little bit Alberta.
Okay, yeah, see, thank you. Thanks for going,
GTA,
pal.
obviously.
Yeah, of course. But
Where else are you gonna end up? It's
Wow.
a tractor beam that pulls you in.
But somebody has to, like, pay Nick to go to those places and find out the thing that is happening. And there's something to be said about Joe Rogan's not going to do that. Joe Rogan's going to take the thing that you report and say, I have an opinion on it, and that's the part that gets spread. What do you do in that environment? You're really just dealing with narrative after people have gathered news.
And this is the sad thing for me, seeing newsrooms, in particular the big newsrooms like CBC and CTV, making all these cuts. And it was a colleague of mine who said, there are indoor cats and there are outdoor cats. There are too few outdoor cats right now, what you're referring to. Those are the people, the reporters, the producers, the camera people, all of those people who are actually on the ground, getting the feel, getting the emotion, being able to tell those stories. And in politics, it's being there with that leader. And this is where I could get into the fact that maybe I was a little disappointed that I didn't see people traveling, reporters traveling with Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, because he wants to be leader of this country. And to have those reporters there, they get that feel, they get that sense, they're following, they're getting more than just what we're seeing through this box. And that's an impression. That's not the real vibe that's actually happening. So I'd like to see, if there's more money spent, and I think there should be, on people who are on the ground doing the jobs, less indoor cats with the narrative in their head is, I saw this is what I think.
And is that, I mean, there's a question on Slido here where somebody is asking, in a changing world order where Canada needs to play more of a leadership role in the global stage, what should change in Canadian media to prepare itself?
I think they need to be leaders, and I think they need to invest in the reporters and the journalists. And yeah, I'm sitting up here and I don't have to balance the books, thank goodness, because reporters are really bad with numbers. But let me tell you this number. This one was interesting to me. So with the Facebook and Instagram ban in 2023 on news, it disrupted the real media on these platforms. Approximately 11 million fewer daily views across all Canadian news sources because of this. So they're not getting actual news, but despite that ban, over half of Canadians reported still getting their political updates through Facebook.
So what are they getting, Hannah?
Yeah. But How
in this
scary
country,
is
they're
that?
actually specifically getting Canada proud, right? Like that's like it's one of the most popular pages. New York Times did a story on this, I think yesterday, about so we say alternative media sources that are having a field day because there has been this absence in. Nick writes a story you can't share it on Facebook and Instagram because. Facebook, Meta, has said, well, we're not really interested.
We don't want to pay for it.
We don't want to pay for this.
And they were
so-
given the option, if they don't want to pay for it, then don't put it up. So they chose not to put it up. But I feel that they're not being good, they're not being good organizations. You have to pay for that information. Nick has done the work.
Yeah.
Nick has done the work for that.
So many nice things.
I know.
Well,
just sit there. You
I don't
just
have to say anything.
I know. You don't have to say anything. He's like
Nick,
the hero in
what do you
here.
attribute to the success of Ottawa Playbook? Because it's been, I think it's exceeded even your expectations.
Well, I think the best part, and I didn't expect this exactly, and it's true, I think, of the whole team who writes this thing.
Yeah.
And we have this little subculture of newsletter writers at Politica, and we all have our own little habits on a daily basis. They're really weird. But we have this relationship with our audience that's more intimate than I ever expect. There are political staffers in Ottawa who will meet somewhere and they'll say, I wake up with you every day.
That's sexy.
And then sometimes they'll be,
What does your wife say?
well, anyway. But then there will be someone else, and they'll say, and my wife, who is also a political staffer, because
Great.
it's Ottawa and everybody's
Yep,
married to
yep.
everybody.
Yeah.
Well,
She's
she does
brilliant,
too,
too.
so we both wake up with you every day. And it's a joke, but
Yeah.
we have this opportunity to reach people in a place they can expect us. And I realize I'm kind of describing a newspaper in this sense, except people didn't wake up with their newspapers beside their bed. They wake up with their phones beside their bed. They check the news. And that allows you to create just a constant sense of conversation where it's mostly one-sided because we are writing for them, but then they will write to us and they will give feedback, and then we will see each other at events, and you create a community that way.
Yeah.
And it's ongoing, and it is not a vicious cycle. It's like a virtuous thing where you are constantly building trust with the core audience that you're so
Trust.
desperate to have read your work.
And it's
Well-
finding them where they're at.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Speaking
And
their
that
language.
is
Yeah.
speaking
Yes,
their
to
language,
young
and that
people.
goes to question here. Canadian youth ages 18 to 30 don't get their voices heard in politics and don't vote. I'm hoping that changes. They voted in 2015 because they had something they wanted to vote for, which is the legalization of marijuana. How do we engage them? I think you go where they're at. And there are a lot of younger people out there, and I just can't figure it out because I didn't grow up through it. But they're telling their stories in different ways, and it's through sound bites, it's through TikTok, it's through Instagram. And oh my God, I'm trying to learn it because it's important to make sure that their voices are heard, and they're doing it in their own ways. And if you continue to do stuff like that and bringing them in and engaging them, and that's an important thing to do because that age bracket, they're going to be running our lives, right?
Yeah.
And you want to have them involved in the discussions. So it might be through shorter sound bites. It might be through the TikToks, through the videos. I haven't quite figured it all out. I think it's beyond our age bracket, but you have to bring them in and help them be involved in these discussions because it's
not
important.
all broad sweeping narratives necessarily.
Yeah.
Narrative isn't just this idea
Yeah.
of an amazing Saturday morning read in the Globe and Mail. Those are wonderful and
They are
essential.
wonderful.
Amazing.
I was like, you
Shannon
want to walk
Proudfoot's-
down to the Globe and Mail?
Sorry?
Jenna Proudfoot's recent profile of Mark Carney.
Yeah,
is
I mean, that's a classic.
work of art.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Yeah.
But we have to experiment with format and give people
So
different options.
I think we're running out of time because
What?
I'm not very good at time management,
no.
but there is a question
Really?
I want to ask you because it's one that interests me.
All right.
With the advent of ChatGPT and GPT-4 and large language models, we're seeing computer-generated narratives, including the narratives about who we are as human beings and as a civilization. And do you think generations from now will understand our history based on a construct? Or do you think we still have the power to own the narrative?
We still have the power to own the narrative. We just have to have humans involved in this AI generation. AI is a process. It's analyzes, it's information, but we have to include and make sure we don't forget diverse cultures and make sure, because it's all, it becomes formula, right? If that isn't fed into the AI, then our history will be forgotten. And that is really bad. So humans have to maintain control over this. and control over the storytelling. And it has to be, we have to start now. And if not, it's going to get away from us.
I think we have this fantasy. If we can go back to Gutenberg for a moment, I think we have this fantasy of like when the printing. I'm going to do it. When the printing press was invented, the church was worried about it because they were like, "Hang on, you mean anyone can just print whatever they want? But we are the authority. This new technology, it can't just be in the hands of everybody." Which is to say, they were worried that books would be vehicles for fake news. And now we kind of think of books as like that's the respectable medium. And then like the internet sort of does another thing, and we have to figure out how to get that under control. It is like the history of media for us to introduce a new one, and then there are people who will hop on it and use it for means that are not necessarily fact-checked, not necessarily journalistic. They are entirely narrative-based. And then eventually we get involved in the regulation of that medium, and eventually we figure out, say, like, if you're going to use AI, you have to be this clear about the ways that you used it, and people need to know that. People need to do that sort of like upfront. I don't know what those rules are.
But
they're clearly emerging. But
what
it's gonna
about
take
a
time.
minister of AI?
Okay, do you want to be that? Is that your job?
I'm not that.
That sounds like
It's Nick's job.
the worst job in the world. Oh my God.
But maybe
But
we need something
but you need
like
like an
that.
institution meant to govern.
In the ministry,
Yeah.
right now, that they appoint a minister of AI. I don't know, I'm just sitting here thinking that we have to get ahead of this.
A handle of this.
And a handle of it. There have to be regulations. It actually can't be just Canadian regulations either. You have to work with other countries on this too, because it is getting, I'm shocked with how fast it's growing.
Yeah.
And I don't think I've caught up with it.
No, not at all.
He's asking if he can say something.
You want to come in?
No,
Yes.
I just want to make sure, because I'm looking at the clock and
let him-
it's ticking up, but I want to make sure that,
Oh, there's a clock.
we're
We're the
somewhat on
last
time.
ones. It's fine.
Yeah.
I think it's fine. We can
I just wanted to
go.
say
We can
that
get wine and come back.
yeah,
right?
sure. This collision of AI with a culture of convenience, like we're so convenience driven. And so you Google something, and now, not to pick on Google, but I guess pick on Google a little bit.
But I don't pay for your stuff.
Yeah,
Well, it summarizes it for you, right?
Yeah.
yeah, and often that summary at the top is incorrect.
Yeah.
And all of the stuff that's been reported by journalists or written and peer reviewed by academics, those results still exist, and they're still on the first page of Google results. But the first thing and the loudest thing, because it's a larger font and it's highlighted and it's right in front of your eyes, is whatever the AI is summarizing. And man, like that's a classic example of the good stuff is right there.
Yeah.
But this stuff is so tantalizing because that's the answer in front of your eyes.
I think AI can assist, but it can't be the author.
Yeah.
But that's hard to control when you have misinformation and disinformation and bots, and you're seeing narratives that are getting amplified and echo chambers for certain opinions, that it seems a little naive to believe that we can somehow manage this by just being better at telling our stories.
That's why Hannah's a minister of AI.
Yeah,
I think
okay.
that's it.
I thought we were
she's
going to
gonna-
appoint Nick.
Okay, Nick is.
Yeah.
So I'm
We'll
sure
work for him.
I'm sure we're over time. Can I just ask one last thing, because this has fascinated me, Elamin. For those who don't know in the room, one of the ways that you know, when you immigrated to Canada, one of the ways that you entered into culture was through your fandom of wrestling. And you said someone once described this to you as Shakespeare with bodies, because it was a hero and a villain, and you know, it's how you started crafting stories. Is that narrative, the oldest narrative in our history, still the one that resonates most with us? And does President Trump understand something about that narrative that maybe we should pay attention to?
The answer is absolutely yes. I mean, I think we tend to think of ourselves as people who are immune to narrative in a lot of ways, even though we're swimming in it all the time. Ta-Nehisi Coates, in his most recent book, The Message, has got this really great passage where he says, politics may be the art of the possible, but art creates the possible of politics, which is to say, the stories we see construct our limits of our understanding of the world. So the reason that you have so much focus on negative freedom, for example, in the United States, is because there's so much media, there's so much film, there's so much television that is about freedom as a freedom from government institutions, freedom from imposition of taxes, freedom from any kind of limitation on the things that you can do, as opposed to a positive conception of freedom. We are swimming in narrative all the time. We receive the narratives all the time, and there's something to be said about when a politician seizes a moment to speak directly to some of these narratives that are like pretty explicitly swimming around us all the time, because what it does is it hooks onto emotion that you're already familiar with. And Donald Trump is not implicitly a wrestling character, he's explicitly one. I mean, like, he, not only is Donald Trump reliving some of like his greatest highlights when he was in the wrestling ring, like when he was in WWE, he uses some of the same lines. But Linda McMahon is a Secretary of Education, and she ran that organization for a long time. And I repeat, Linda McMahon is a Secretary of Education.
I think you had to say it twice.
Yeah, I mean, it's absurd. It's sort of like this absurd conception of, we always think of ourselves as like completely divorced from narrative, like completely like above it, but we are susceptible to it and we can fall to it every time. And all it takes is a slight little tweak of that narrative, and then suddenly you are bringing your own history that you're familiar with, of all the books and all the movies and all the television shows that you watched that hit at that notion. And all the politician has to do is kind of like activate the script that you're already kind of familiar with, and they're in deeper with you than they maybe otherwise would have been, because they're not making an argument, they're making an emotional appeal in that moment. Yeah. And an emotional appeal is like one of the most powerful tools that we all have, even though sometimes we tend to like maybe scoff at them. They're around us all the time.
Well, thank you very much. I must bring this panel to a close now because I've already gone over, but you are all fantastic. I can't wait to have a cocktail with you and have a longer discussion. So thank you, Nick, Hannah, and Elamin. And thank all of you for your attention. This has been a fantastic panel. They're driving me crazy, but they're fantastic.
We've been driving him crazy, Inez.
Let's give them a big hand. Thank you very much.